The mirror in my cramped Bronx apartment reflected a version of myself I barely recognized. 20 years old, and tonight marked a milestone I'd never imagined reaching. My first real date. The navy dress I'd bought with my last $120, hugged curves I usually kept hidden beneath oversized sweaters and textbooks. Maya Collins, the girl who'd spent 4 years since her parents' death buried in psychology textbooks and part-time jobs, was finally taking a chance on something that wasn't academic. Derek Thompson had been persistent for months. Charming smiles across lecture halls, casual conversations that lingered after class, study sessions that felt more like flirtation than education. When he'd asked me to dinner at Il Sogno, one of Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurants, I'd been shocked. Boys like Derek, confident, well-connected, effortlessly attractive, didn't usually notice girls like me. Girls who worked at bookstores to pay rent, who counted every dollar twice before spending it, who hadn't owned a dress this expensive until today. The subway ride from the Bronx to the Upper East Side felt like traveling between worlds. My reflection in the darkened windows showed a stranger dressed in borrowed confidence, clutching a purse that contained everything I had left. $23.16. I'd counted it 3 times before leaving my apartment, each recount accompanied by a prayer that it would somehow multiply into enough for dinner at a restaurant, where appetizers cost more than my daily food budget. Manhattan's Friday evening energy pulsed around me as I emerged from the subway. Office workers in $1,000 shoes hurried past, their conversations peppered with casual mentions of weekend homes and vacation plans that represented more money than I'd seen in years. The closer I got to Il Sogno, the more I questioned Derek's invitation. What did he see in the scholarship kid from the Bronx who wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation and had never been on a date? Il Sogno materialized from the Manhattan evening like something from a movie. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, and the scent of garlic, basil, and expensive wine created an atmosphere of luxury I'd only read about in novels. Couples dressed in clothing that cost more than my semester's rent murmured in intimate conversations, while servers moved with choreographed precision. Every surface gleamed. Every detail spoke of money and refinement that felt as foreign to me as another language. "Table for 2, I told the hostess, my voice steadier than my thundering heartbeat. Under Thompson. She consulted her reservation book with practiced indifference, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the leather binding. Her assessment was swift but thorough. Discount shoes, drugstore makeup, nervous energy that screamed of someone out of her depth. "Right this way, miss." The table overlooked the restaurant's main dining area, positioned perfectly for observation and conversation. I slid into the velvet chair, hyper-aware of every sound, every glance from other diners who seemed to belong in this world of casual extravagance. The menu prices made my stomach clench. $35 for the cheapest pasta dish, $42 for chicken, $58 for fish. My $23 suddenly felt microscopic. $8.15 became $8.30. $8.30 stretched toward 9 o'clock. Around me, other couples shared wine and laughter, their conversations a steady hum of contentment. I checked my phone obsessively, refreshing messages that never came, dialing Derek's number only to reach voicemail each time. The excitement I'd felt getting ready transformed into something colder, sharper. Humiliation mixed with genuine concern. Had something happened to him? "Will you be ordering this evening? Or are we waiting for your companion?" The waiter's tone carried just enough condescension to make my cheeks burn. His eyes assessed my modest dress, my discount shoes, my obvious discomfort with surgical precision. Behind his professional smile lurked impatience and barely concealed disdain. "He's just running late," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Maybe. Could I just get some water for now?" The waiter's smile was sharp as winter glass. "Of course. I'll give you a few more minutes." But minutes became an eternity. Other diners glanced my way with mixtures of pity and curiosity. The couple at the neighboring table whispered behind manicured hands, their conversation punctuated by sideways looks that made my skin crawl with embarrassment. I counted the money in my purse again, as if repetition might somehow make it multiply. $23.16. Not enough for the cheapest item on the menu. Not enough to maintain the pretense that I belonged here. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the sound cutting through my spiral of self-doubt. Payment overdue, $75,000. 48 hours or consequences for you and your backup contact. You know what we want. Ice flooded my veins, chasing away the heat of embarrassment with something far more terrifying. My hands trembled as I read the message again. Then again. $75,000. Backup contact. The words swam before my eyes, each reading making less sense than the last. This had to be some kind of mistake. Some random message that had found its way to my phone by accident. But something about the specific language, the cold certainty of the threat, made my chest tighten with genuine fear. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, my mind racing through possibilities. Wrong number. Spam. Prank. None of the explanations felt right. The message was too specific, too personal. Backup contact suggested knowledge of my existence that felt invasive and wrong. Who would list me as a backup contact for anything, let alone something involving $75,000? The waiter returned, his patience visibly strained, hovering beside my table like a vulture waiting for roadkill. Other servers shot glances our way, the solo diner holding up prime real estate on a busy Friday night, clearly unable to afford the privilege. "Miss, I'm going to need you to order something or I'll take care of this." The voice came from behind me, low and controlled, carrying an authority that made the waiter step back instinctively. The sound wrapped around me like silk, commanding attention without demanding it. I turned to find a man standing beside our table, and the air itself seemed to shift in his presence. Tall, easily 6 feet, with dark hair styled with casual perfection and eyes the color of winter storms. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored with the kind of precision that whispered of money and power, fitting his broad shoulders and lean frame like it had been sewn directly onto his body. But it was his face that stopped my breath. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw marked by a small scar near his chin, and an intensity that made me feel exposed despite being fully clothed. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened, paths cleared, attention focused solely on him. "Sir, this is a private matter," the waiter began, but his protest died under the stranger's gaze. No, the stranger's eyes never left mine, and I felt pinned in place by their intensity. "It's not." He placed a black American Express card on the table without breaking eye contact, the gesture casual but definitive. "Cover whatever she wants. Add 20% for your trouble. And next time someone sits alone in your restaurant for 45 minutes, you bring them bread and water without attitude." The transformation in the waiter's demeanor was instantaneous and complete. Professional courtesy replaced condescension with startling speed, his spine straightening as he recognized the authority in the stranger's voice. "Of course, sir. Right away. My apologies for any inconvenience." As the waiter retreated with nervous efficiency, the stranger slid into the chair across from me with fluid grace. Up close, his presence was even more overwhelming. He smelled of cedar and leather, expensive cologne mixed with something indefinably masculine that made my pulse quicken in ways I didn't understand. His hands, folded calmly on the table, bore no wedding ring, but displayed a heavy signet ring on his right pinky finger, old gold with an intricate design that caught the restaurant's soft lighting. "You didn't have to do that," I managed, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears, smaller and breathier than usual. "Nobody makes a woman cry in my city without answering to me." His words carried weight that had nothing to do with volume, each syllable deliberate and meaningful. Especially not a woman who's brave enough to wait alone for someone who clearly doesn't deserve her time. The way he spoke, with such casual certainty about his city, made something flutter in my chest. This wasn't just confidence. This was the assurance of someone accustomed to being obeyed, to having his word carry consequences. "How do you know I was waiting for someone?" Instead of answering immediately, he gestured toward my phone, still clutched in my trembling hands, with the threatening message displayed on its screen. "That message you received. Show it to me. I don't even know who you are." His lips curved in what might have been amusement, though his eyes remained serious. "My name is Lorenzo Marcelli." He said it like an introduction, and a revelation rolled into one, the syllables rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "And that message is from people you definitely don't want to meet." The weight of Lorenzo's gaze settled over me like a physical presence, heavy with unspoken knowledge that made my skin prickle with awareness. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself sliding my phone across the white tablecloth toward him. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, the contact brief but electric, sending an unwelcome shiver up my arm. His eyes scanned the message with professional efficiency, but I caught the subtle tightening around his mouth, the way his jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Whatever this meant, it wasn't good. When he looked up, his expression had hardened into something that belonged in boardrooms where life-changing decisions were made with casual cruelty. "Russo," he said, the name carrying weight I didn't understand. "This message wasn't meant for you. Someone listed you as a backup contact without your knowledge." His fingers drummed once against the table, a controlled gesture that somehow conveyed more menace than shouting would have. "The question is, who and why? I have no idea what any of this means." My voice sounded small in the restaurant's elegant atmosphere, overwhelmed by crystal and marble and the casual wealth surrounding us. $75,000? I don't know anyone with that kind of money, but you know someone stupid enough to borrow it from people who collect with interest rates measured in blood. Lorenzo's tone remained conversational, but something predatory flickered in those storm-gray eyes. "Derek Thompson. Columbia University, junior year. Parents own a tech startup in Seattle. Gambling problem. Recently expanded into pharmaceutical recreation." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process not just the information, but the casual way he delivered it. "How do you know Derek? How do you know any of that?" Instead of answering, Lorenzo made a subtle gesture with his left hand. Within seconds, the air around our table shifted. I became aware of movement at the restaurant's edges. Men in dark suits who hadn't been there moments before, positioning themselves with military precision near exits and key vantage points. They moved like shadows, professional and silent, drawing no attention from other diners who remained blissfully unaware that the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The waiter returned with practiced deference, carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He poured without being asked, the ritual performed with choreographed precision that spoke of experience with demanding clientele. Lorenzo dismissed him with a barely perceptible nod, and we were alone again in our bubble of tense conversation. "In my line of work, information is currency," Lorenzo said, lifting the wine glass but not drinking. "And right now, you're sitting in the middle of a transaction that could get you killed." He leaned forward slightly, the movement bringing his scent closer, cedar and danger, and something indefinably masculine that made my pulse quicken despite my fear. "Derek Thompson owes the Russo family $75,000. They have a reputation for creative collection methods." The restaurant around us continued its elegant dance of Friday night dinner service. Other couples sharing intimate conversations while I sat across from a stranger who spoke of death threats like discussing the weather. "You're telling me Derek put my name down as some kind of guarantee for illegal gambling debts?" "Among other things." Lorenzo's eyes never left mine, reading expressions I didn't know I was making. The Russos don't distinguish between willing participants and unwilling collateral. If Derek can't pay, they'll use whatever leverage they can find, including you. My hands trembled as I processed the implications. 20 years of carefully constructed safety, of studying hard and working harder to build a life free from the violence that had claimed my parents, and I'd been dragged into exactly the kind of world I'd spent years avoiding. "I need to call the police." "And tell them what? That you received a threatening text message? That someone used your name without permission?" Lorenzo's smile held no warmth. "The NYPD has more pressing concerns than unsubstantiated threats against college students. By the time they took you seriously, you'd already be missing." The casual certainty in his voice made my blood run cold. This wasn't speculation or intimidation. This was professional assessment from someone who understood exactly how these situations played out. Then what am I supposed to do? Accept my protection. The words came without hesitation, delivered with the same authority he'd used to dismiss the waiter. "Until we resolve Derek's problem, you're not safe on your own." I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the restaurant's refined atmosphere. Protection from a complete stranger who somehow knows everything about my personal life? How is that any different from the threat? Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. a subtle realigning that made him seem larger, more dangerous. Around us, I became newly aware of his men, still positioned at strategic points throughout the restaurant. They weren't threatening. They simply existed in spaces that happened to control every exit, every sightline, every potential threat. "Because I give you a choice," he said simply. "The Russos won't." My phone buzzed against the table where Lorenzo had placed it. Another message, this time from Derek. "Maya, I'm sorry about tonight. Family emergency." Rain check, the casual tone, the complete absence of acknowledgement about the threat I'd received, made my stomach churn with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Lorenzo read the message over my shoulder, his presence close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "He doesn't know they've made contact," he observed, "which means he's either incredibly naive or incredibly stupid. Maybe he really did have a family emergency." Even as I said it, the words felt hollow. The timing was too convenient. The message too casual for someone whose debts had apparently put both our lives in danger. "Maya," the way Lorenzo said my name made something flutter low in my chest. Intimate and possessive in a way that should have alarmed me, but instead sent warmth spreading through my veins. "Look around this restaurant. Look at the way people dress, the way they carry themselves, the casual discussion of summer houses and private schools. Do you see anyone here who looks like they worry about money?" I followed his gaze, taking in the casual display of wealth surrounding us. Designer handbags left carelessly on chairs, watches that cost more than cars, conversations peppered with mentions of vacations and purchases that represented more money than I'd seen in years. "No, Derek brought you here for a reason. Not because he wanted to impress you with his own money. His family's comfortable but not wealthy enough for regular dinners at Il Sogno. He brought you here because he needed to be seen in the right place by the right people." Lorenzo's fingers drummed against the table again, the gesture controlled, but somehow menacing. He was using you as camouflage. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The months of attention, the casual flirtation, the sudden invitation to an expensive restaurant far above a college student's normal budget. I hadn't been a romantic interest. I'd been a prop, a way for Derek to maintain appearances while his life spiraled into debt and desperation. "How long have you been watching me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Not you, specifically. Derek." Lorenzo's honesty was brutal and refreshing after months of Derek's calculated charm. "But you've been in the background of his surveillance for weeks. The scholarship student who works at the bookstore, who takes care of herself, who doesn't ask questions or demand explanations." His eyes held mine with uncomfortable intensity. "You were perfect for what he needed." Rage flared in my chest, hot and cleansing after hours of humiliation and fear. "And what do you need?" "To keep you alive." The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard. "The Russos have your name now. They'll research you the same way I did. Family history, financial situation, social connections, vulnerabilities. They'll find your parents' accident, your student loans, your job at the bookstore. They'll identify every pressure point in your life and apply leverage until you give them what they want." "Which is what, exactly?" Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, the movement casual but somehow predatory. "Derek. But if they can't have him, they'll settle for making an example of someone he cares about." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Even if he doesn't actually care." The restaurant continued its elegant choreography around us, other diners lost in their own conversations while I sat paralyzed by the realization that my entire life had changed in the space of a single evening. The girl who'd arrived nervous about her first date was gone, replaced by someone who needed to understand the rules of a world she'd never wanted to enter. "If I accept your protection," I said carefully, "what does that mean exactly?" "It means you don't go anywhere alone. It means you don't return to your apartment until we've secured it. It means you trust me to handle the Russo problem while keeping you safe." Lorenzo's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, but his eyes held something that might have been gentleness. "And it means you accept that your old life, the one where you could walk through the city without looking over your shoulder, is over." I refused Lorenzo's offer to go to what he called a safe house, the words conjuring images of windowless rooms and locked doors that made my skin crawl with claustrophobia. Instead, I insisted on returning to my Bronx apartment, clinging to the illusion that familiar walls might somehow shield me from the reality of my situation. Lorenzo didn't argue. which surprised me more than resistance would have. He simply nodded, made another subtle gesture, and I knew without being told that his protection would follow me home whether I wanted it or not. The subway ride back felt different now. Every passenger a potential threat, every stop an opportunity for danger to board. I found myself cataloging faces, memorizing details the way I'd learned to study for exams. Compulsively, desperately, as if retention might somehow guarantee survival. Lorenzo hadn't accompanied me, citing the need to handle some business, but his absence felt more ominous than reassuring. Men like him didn't leave loose ends unattended. My building looked exactly the same as when I'd left hours earlier. Tired brick facade, broken security door, the lingering scent of decades of cooking and lives lived too close together. But climbing the 4 flights to my studio apartment, I felt like a stranger returning to someone else's life. The girl who'd left for her first date no longer existed, replaced by someone who checked corners before entering rooms and listened for footsteps that didn't belong. The changes started small. My overdue electric bill, the one that had kept me awake 3 nights running, was marked paid in full when I checked online. The internet service I'd been planning to cancel to save money had been upgraded to premium service. When I called the electric company, they told me an anonymous benefactor had covered not just the outstanding balance, but 6 months in advance. The internet provider said the same thing. My hands shook as I hung up the phone. Lorenzo had invaded my life with surgical precision, identifying my vulnerabilities and addressing them without permission or explanation. The money should have been a relief. God knew I needed it. But instead, it felt like chains made of gold, beautiful and inescapable. The knock on my door came at 8 the next morning, soft but insistent. I'd barely slept, every sound in the building making me jump, every siren in the distance a potential harbinger of violence. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in an expensive coat holding several garment bags, her professional smile perfectly calibrated for someone accustomed to delivering goods to people who could afford them. "Miss Collins, I have a delivery from Mr. Marcelli." The dresses were beautiful. Silk and cashmere and fabrics I couldn't identify, but knew were expensive by the way they felt beneath my fingers. Professional attire that would let me blend into Lorenzo's world. Cocktail dresses that transform my reflection into someone who belonged in restaurants like Il Sogno. Casual wear that somehow made my modest apartment feel shabbier by comparison. I called the number from Lorenzo's business card, my anger building with each ring. When he answered, his voice carried the same controlled authority I remembered from the restaurant. "I assume you received the delivery." "I'm not a charity case or your possession," I snapped, surprising myself with my vehemence. "You can't just pay my bills and dress me up like some kind of doll." "You're not my possession," he agreed, and something in his tone made me pause. "You're under my protection. There's a difference." "What difference?" "You're still controlling my life without asking. I'm keeping you alive." The words carried weight that silenced my protests. "The Russos don't care about your independence or your pride. They care about leverage and results. If you're going to survive this, you need to understand the rules of the world you've been dragged into." That evening, he took me to dinner. Not Il Sogno this time, but a place even more exclusive. A restaurant I'd never heard of because it didn't advertise, didn't take reservations from the general public, didn't need to compete for clientele. When we arrived, the maitre d' greeted Lorenzo by name and led us to a private dining room where crystal glasses caught candlelight like captured stars. And the silence was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. "This place doesn't officially exist," Lorenzo explained, as servers appeared with courses I hadn't ordered, each dish a masterpiece of presentation and flavor that cost more than I typically spent on food in a week. "The chef trained in Paris, the wine comes from private vineyards, and the guest list is limited to people who understand the value of discretion." I watched him eat with the same controlled precision he applied to everything else. Every movement deliberate and efficient. The contrast between his casual elegance and my nervous energy felt stark, emphasizing the gulf between our worlds. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to understand what you're dealing with." He set down his fork, giving me his complete attention. "The Russos operate in this world too. Private dinners where business is conducted over $1 million wine, handshake agreements that reshape entire industries, Conversations that never officially happen but change everything. The weight of his gaze made me fidget with my napkin, hyper-aware of how the expensive dress clung to my body, how the unfamiliar jewelry felt against my skin. Everything about this evening was designed to seduce. The ambiance, the luxury, the undivided attention of a man who commanded respect through presence alone. And you? What's your excuse for being here? Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to interpret but heavy with meaning. I inherited this life. Lost my parents when I was 18, assumed control of family interests that had been built over generations. His voice carried a weariness that seemed at odds with his apparent youth. Sometimes the only choice is between becoming what people fear or being destroyed by those who already are. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. Beneath the expensive suits and casual authority, Lorenzo was only 32 years old, young to carry the weight I sensed pressing down on his shoulders. What happened to your parents? Car bomb, ordered by the Russo family over a territorial dispute that had been simmering for years. His tone remained conversational, but I caught the way his hands tightened imperceptibly around his wine glass. They wanted to send a message about the consequences of resistance. The casual mention of car bombs and territorial disputes should have terrified me, but instead I found myself studying the man across from me with new eyes. The scar on his chin, the way he positioned himself with his back to the wall, the constant awareness of exits and potential threats. These weren't affectations, but survival mechanisms learned through necessity. How long have you been at war with them? 14 years. The number hung in the air between us, representing half a lifetime of conflict and violence. Since the night I decided their message had been received, and it was time to send one back. The server returned to refill our wine glasses, his movements silent and professional. Around us, the restaurant continued its orchestrated dance of service and luxury, but our conversation had shifted into territory that felt intimate despite its darkness. Lorenzo was showing me pieces of himself that I suspected few people ever saw, not the controlled businessman or the dangerous authority figure, but the young man who'd been thrust into a world of violence and responsibility before he was ready. Is that what this is about? Using me to send another message? No. The directness of his answer surprised me. This is about something I haven't felt in 14 years. Which is? He leaned forward slightly, the movement bringing his scent closer. Cedar and danger, and something that made my pulse quicken despite my attempts at emotional distance. The desire to protect something because I choose to, not because I have to. The admission hung between us, heavy with implication. In the candlelight, Lorenzo's features seemed softer somehow, less like carved marble, and more like flesh and blood. The dangerous authority was still there, but tempered by something that might have been longing. I should go home, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. You should. His agreement came with a smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. But you won't, because despite everything you've told yourself about wanting a quiet life, about avoiding the kind of violence that took your parents, you're curious about what happens next. He was right, and we both knew it. The scared girl who'd been stood up at Il Sogno was still there, but she was sharing space with someone new, someone who felt alive in ways she'd never experienced, someone drawn to the controlled danger Lorenzo represented like a moth to flame. It should have been a warning. Instead, it felt like permission. What happens next? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Lorenzo's smile deepened, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely happy. Now we find out exactly how much trouble Derek's gotten himself into, and we decide what we're going to do about it. The first sign of trouble came on Tuesday morning as I walked across Columbia's campus toward my psychology lecture. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and possibility. Students around me discussing weekend plans and midterm exams with the casual confidence of people whose biggest worry was academic performance. I envied them their innocence, missing the days when my greatest fear was failing a test, rather than becoming collateral damage in someone else's war. The black sedan materialized from the campus traffic like a predator emerging from tall grass, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun as it pulled alongside the sidewalk. My steps faltered, muscle memory from years of psychology textbooks recognizing threat patterns before my conscious mind could process them. Fight-or-flight responses flooded my system, adrenaline sharpening my awareness of every detail. The car's expensive silence, the way other students gave it unconscious wide berth, the subtle wrongness of something so obviously predatory in an environment designed for learning. Two men emerged from the vehicle with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of professional experience. They wore dark suits that couldn't quite hide the bulges beneath their jackets, and their eyes swept the campus with the methodical assessment of security personnel or something more dangerous. The taller one approached while his partner remained by the car, positioned to block any attempt at escape. Maya Collins. Not a question. A statement delivered with casual authority. His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, something that made my name sound foreign and somehow threatening. You're a difficult woman to approach. My psychology training kicked in. Analytical mind cataloging threat indicators, while my body prepared for violence. Aggressive posture, hands kept visible but ready, eyes that never quite focused on me, but constantly scanned for potential interference. These weren't campus security or local police. These were Lorenzo's enemies, and they'd found me despite his protection. I think you have the wrong person, I managed, proud that my voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. No mistake. The man smiled, the expression cold and predatory. We know exactly who you are. Derek Thompson's backup contact, Lorenzo Marcelli's new pet project. He stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that made every nerve ending scream warnings. We have photos of you entering restaurants, leaving his men's cars, wearing clothes that cost more than most people make in a month. You're not as invisible as you think. The casual mention of surveillance photographs sent ice through my veins. They'd been watching me, documenting my movements, building a case against my involvement in affairs I barely understood. The expensive dresses Lorenzo had sent suddenly felt like evidence of guilt, marking me as complicit in whatever war these men were fighting. What do you want? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Conversation. The word carried implications that had nothing to do with talking. About your friend Derek and his unfortunate financial obligations. About Lorenzo Marcelli's interest in protecting someone he barely knows. About the value of cooperation versus the consequences of resistance. Around us, campus life continued its normal rhythm. Students hurrying between classes, professors discussing research, maintenance workers tending to the grounds. None of them noticed the potential violence simmering beneath the surface of what appeared to be a normal conversation. I was surrounded by people but completely alone, isolated in a bubble of threat that no one else could see. I don't know anything about Derek's debts, I said, taking a small step backward only to find the second man had moved to flank me while I was distracted. Perhaps, but you know Lorenzo Marcelli, and that makes you useful. The tall man's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. He has something that belongs to us. Specifically, he's assumed responsibility for a debt that should have remained Derek's problem. We're here to discuss terms for its resolution. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Lorenzo had done exactly what he'd said he would, handled the Derek problem. But instead of making it disappear, he'd apparently made himself the target, accepting responsibility for debts he hadn't incurred to protect someone he barely knew. The thought should have been reassuring, but instead, it filled me with a terror that went beyond personal safety. Before I could respond, the campus atmosphere shifted. The change was subtle at first. A black SUV pulling up behind the sedan. Two men in expensive suits emerging with the kind of casual confidence that spoke of absolute authority. I recognized one of them as Marco, Lorenzo's associate from the restaurant. His presence transforming the confrontation from potential violence into something more complex and dangerous. Gentlemen, Marco's voice carried the same controlled authority as Lorenzo's, cutting through the tension like a blade. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The Russo men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. But they didn't retreat. We were in the middle of a college campus, surrounded by witnesses, which provided a different kind of protection than Lorenzo's usual methods. Violence here would bring police, media attention, federal investigation, consequences even crime families preferred to avoid. No misunderstanding, the tall man replied. Just a message being delivered. And now it's been received. Marco stepped closer, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller and more dangerous despite his calm demeanor. Miss Collins is under Mr. Marcelli's protection. Any further contact should go through appropriate channels. She's Derek Thompson's responsibility first. His debt, his collateral. Derek Thompson's obligations have been assumed by my employer. Marco's smile carried the same cold precision I'd seen in Lorenzo's expressions, which makes this conversation unnecessary and potentially problematic for everyone involved. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, threat and counter-threat dancing beneath the surface of polite conversation. Around us, students continued their morning routines, oblivious to the potential for violence that shimmered in the autumn air like heat waves. I found myself cataloging escape routes, exit strategies, anything that might help me survive if this turned physical. Finally, the tall Russo man stepped back, his retreat graceful, but definitive. Mr. Marcelli's generosity is noted, but generosity has limits, and debts have consequences. Miss Collins should remember that protection is only as strong as the person providing it. They departed as smoothly as they'd arrived, the black sedan disappearing into campus traffic while Marco watched with the patience of someone accustomed to managing threats. Only when they were completely gone did I realize I'd been holding my breath. My body coiled with tension I hadn't noticed building. "You're safe," Marco said. But his eyes continued scanning the campus for additional threats. But this changes things. They've made direct contact, which means they're escalating beyond Mr. Marcelli's expectations. The casual mention of escalation sent fresh waves of fear through me. What does that mean? It means the game has changed. Marco gestured toward his SUV, an invitation that felt more like a command. "Mr. Marcelli needs to speak with you immediately." An hour later, I sat in Lorenzo's private office, a space that spoke of old money and older violence. The room was lined with books that looked genuinely read, their spines cracked with use, while artifacts that might have been family heirlooms or war trophies decorated shelves and walls. Lorenzo himself stood behind a massive desk, his usual controlled composure strained in ways I was learning to read. "They approached you directly," he said without preamble. "On Columbia's campus, in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses. That's not intimidation. That's a declaration." "A declaration of what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "War." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and promise of violence to come. Derek's debt was the excuse. You were the message. They wanted me to know that my protection isn't absolute, that they can reach anything I care about whenever they choose. The casual way he said, "anything I care about," sent warmth through my chest despite the circumstances. In less than a week, I'd somehow become important to a man who measured importance in blood and territory. Someone worth protecting at the cost of escalating conflict with dangerous enemies. There's something else. Lorenzo moved around the desk, coming close enough that I could smell the cedar and leather scent I was beginning to associate with safety. Derek finally surfaced. "He wants to meet with you." My heart stuttered in my chest. After days of wondering where he was, whether he was safe, whether his absence was voluntary or forced, the prospect of finally getting answers felt both relieving and terrifying. "When?" "Tonight." Lorenzo's expression was unreadable, but I caught something in his eyes that might have been concern. "He says he has an explanation for everything, an apology for putting you in danger, and a solution to the Russo problem." The words should have been reassuring, but something about Lorenzo's tone made them sound more like a warning than hope. "You don't believe him. I believe he's desperate, and desperate men make dangerous choices." Lorenzo reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek with surprising gentleness. "The question is whether you're ready to hear what those choices have cost both of you." Derek arrived at my apartment building at 9:30 that evening, looking like a ghost of the charming college student I'd thought I knew. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his designer polo wrinkled and stained, and the confident swagger that had first attracted my attention had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone running from consequences he couldn't escape. When I opened the door, the smell of stale cigarettes and desperation clung to him like cologne applied too liberally. "Maya, thank God." His relief seemed genuine, but something in his eyes made me step back instead of forward. I know you must have questions, but I can explain everything. I can fix this. I'd agreed to see him against Lorenzo's explicit warnings, but not without precautions. Marco's men were positioned throughout the building, invisible but present, while listening devices Lorenzo's people had installed would record every word. The knowledge that I wasn't truly alone gave me courage to face the man who'd dragged me into this nightmare. You stood me up, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering beneath my surface calm. Then I got a text message threatening my life over $75,000 I've never seen. So yes, I have questions. Derek moved into my small living space with the restless energy of someone who couldn't sit still, his eyes darting toward windows and exits in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of Lorenzo's constant vigilance. But where Lorenzo's awareness spoke of controlled competence, Derek's paranoia felt desperate and unhinged. The dinner, that was a mistake. I got cold feet because I knew things were getting complicated, and I didn't want to drag you into something dangerous. He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture revealing trembling fingers that spoke of withdrawal or terror. But then, they used your number anyway. And everything got worse. They used my number because you gave it to them. The accusation hung in the air between us, heavy with betrayal and broken trust. As a backup contact for debts I never knew existed. I had to. The words exploded from him with desperate intensity. You don't understand what these people are like when you can't pay. They don't just want money. They want insurance, guarantees, leverage over everything you care about. The casual admission that he'd used me as collateral sent rage flooding through my system, hot and cleansing after days of fear and confusion. So you decided my life was acceptable collateral for your gambling debts? It wasn't supposed to matter. Derek's voice cracked with strain. I had a sure thing, a guaranteed win that would have covered everything. But the fights were fixed differently than I expected, and suddenly I was in deeper than ever. Fixed fights. Gambling. Jesus, Derek! What else haven't you told me? I studied his face, seeing signs I'd missed or ignored during months of casual flirtation. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes never quite focused, the restless energy that I'd interpreted as confidence, but now recognized as something more chemically induced. There's more. His admission came quietly, shamefully, as if speaking the words would make them more real. The cocaine I was supposed to sell. I used most of it instead of moving it, and now they want payment for product that doesn't exist anymore. The pieces of Derek's destruction clicked together with sickening clarity. Gambling debts had led to drug dealing, which had led to addiction, which had created more debts in an endless cycle that had ultimately dragged me into the crossfire. I felt nauseous thinking about how close I'd come to getting romantically involved with someone whose life was such a disaster. How much do you actually owe them? $75,000 for the gambling, another $25,000 for the drugs. Derek's math came out too quickly, as if he'd calculated it obsessively. But Lorenzo Martelli paid off the primary debt. He assumed responsibility for everything. Why would he do that? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Derek's laugh was bitter and knowing. Because he wants you, Maya. I've been watching the way he looks at you, the way his men follow you around like your precious cargo. He paid my debts to get you away from the Russos. But that just made you his responsibility instead. Something cold settled in my stomach as Derek's words registered. You've been watching me? I had to know if my plan was working. Derek's admission came with a desperate smile that made my skin crawl. The Russos have been pressuring me for weeks, threatening to hurt people I care about if I didn't find a way to pay. When I realized Lorenzo Martelli was interested in you, it seemed like the perfect solution. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, sharp and clean as a surgical blade. You set this up. The dinner invitation, the timing, everything. You orchestrated this entire situation. I needed Lorenzo to see you, to understand what was at stake. Men like him, they don't respond to begging or promises. But they respond to protecting something beautiful, something worth fighting for. Derek stepped closer, his expression a mixture of desperation and calculated charm. I knew if he saw you in that restaurant, saw how vulnerable you were, he'd want to help. By assuming your debts and putting me in even more danger, my voice rose despite my attempts at control. You turned me into bait for a man you knew was dangerous. But it worked. Lorenzo Martelli is protecting you now, paying for your expenses, making sure you're safe. You're better off than you've ever been. Derek's logic was twisted but internally consistent, the reasoning of someone who'd convinced himself that manipulation was actually altruism. The sound of my apartment's fire escape window sliding open made us both freeze. Marco appeared with fluid grace, his presence transforming the space from private conversation to something more official and dangerous. Behind him came two other men I recognized from Lorenzo's security detail, their positions blocking exits with professional efficiency. Mr. Thompson. Marco's voice carried the same controlled authority as Lorenzo's. You're under arrest. What? Derek spun toward the window, his face pale with terror. I haven't done anything illegal. Everything I told you was the truth. Everything you told her was recorded. Marco held up a small device that had been transmitting our conversation to Lorenzo's people, including your admission to conspiracy, fraud, and using Miss Collins as unwilling collateral in criminal enterprises. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Derek had been working with the Russos since the beginning, feeding them information about Lorenzo's security procedures, my daily routines, even details about my emotional responses to various situations. The shy college student who'd gradually worn down my resistance had been performing a role, gathering intelligence that could be used to manipulate both Lorenzo and me. Maya, you have to understand, Derek pleaded as Marco's men moved to restrain him. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just needed a way out, and this seemed like the safest option for everyone, except me. The words came out colder than I'd intended, but I felt frozen inside, watching the careful illusion of Derek's interest crumble into something calculated and predatory. I was never a person to you, was I? Just a tool you could use to solve your problems. That's not true. I do care about you, in my own way. Derek's protests sounded hollow even to his own ears. But caring doesn't pay debts, or keep dangerous people from hurting the ones you love. Marco's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and his expression darkened as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, his attention shifted to me, with an urgency that made my stomach clench with fresh fear. We need to leave. Now. His tone brooked no argument. The Russos just hit one of Mr. Marcelli's safe houses. They're escalating faster than anyone anticipated. Through my apartment window, I could see black vehicles pulling up to the building, their occupants moving with military precision toward the entrance. Lorenzo's protection had been breached. Derek's betrayal had provided enemies with intelligence they needed, and I was about to be caught in the middle of a war I'd never asked to join. Where is Lorenzo? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the terror clawing at my throat. Handling the situation. Marco's answer was deliberately vague, but something in his expression suggested the situation was more dangerous than he wanted to admit. But right now, you're the priority. They can't get to him if they can't get to you. As we prepared to leave through the fire escape, Derek made one final desperate plea. Maya, I'm sorry. I know you'll never forgive me, but I really did think this was the best solution for everyone. I looked at him one last time, seeing not the charming college student who'd slowly won my trust, but the desperate addict who'd sold my safety for a chance at escaping his own mistakes. The best solution would have been telling me the truth and letting me make my own choices. Would you have chosen to help if I'd asked directly? The question hung in the air as Marco hustled me toward the window, and whatever uncertain future waited beyond it. The honest answer was that I probably would have tried to help Derek if he'd explained his situation honestly. But he'd chosen manipulation over trust, deception over honesty. And now we were all paying the price for his cowardice. I guess we'll never know, I said, following Marco into the October night and leaving Derek to face the consequences of choices that had destroyed more lives than just his own. The safe house in Queens felt like a cage made of luxury and paranoia. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered stunning views of the Manhattan skyline, but I knew they were bulletproof glass designed to keep the world out as much as to let light in. Marco's men stationed themselves at strategic points throughout the penthouse, their presence a constant reminder that beauty and danger could coexist in the same space. For 3 days, I existed in suspended animation, waiting for news about Lorenzo while trying to process the magnitude of Derek's betrayal. The books Lorenzo's people had provided, psychology texts, literature, even some philosophy, helped occupy my mind, but couldn't quiet the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake in trusting anyone in this world of calculated violence and beautiful lies. On the fourth morning, restlessness drove me to explore the safe house more thoroughly. In what appeared to be Lorenzo's private study, I discovered a collection of photographs tucked behind legal documents in his desk drawer. My hands trembled as I recognized my own face staring back at me. Images taken over months without my knowledge or consent. But these weren't surveillance photos like the ones the Russos had mentioned. These were different, more personal somehow. Me leaving the bookstore where I worked, captured in afternoon sunlight that made my hair look golden. Me sitting on Columbia's campus reading, completely absorbed in a textbook, unaware of being observed. Me laughing at something a classmate had said, my face animated with genuine joy. The dates written on the back told a story that made my chest tight with emotions I couldn't identify. Lorenzo had been watching me for almost a year, not because of Derek's debts or some criminal conspiracy, but for reasons that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something far more personal and complicated. The last photograph in the collection stopped my breath entirely. It showed me sitting beside my father in the hospital during his final weeks, reading aloud from a psychology textbook, because the nurses said familiar voices sometimes helped patients fighting for consciousness. I was younger in the image, maybe 18, my face drawn with exhaustion, but determined to maintain hope even when the medical team had given up. On the back, written in Lorenzo's precise handwriting, the day I realized some people are worth protecting just because they exist. You weren't supposed to find those. I spun around to find Lorenzo standing in the doorway, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and a fresh bruise colored his left cheekbone. But his eyes held the same intensity I remembered, now mixed with something that might have been embarrassment at being caught in such a vulnerable revelation. "You've been watching me for a year," I said. The photographs scattered across the desk between us like evidence of crimes I couldn't name. Longer than that. His admission came without hesitation or apology. "Your father worked as an independent accountant for several businesses in the city. One of them was a restaurant owned by my predecessor's organization. When he died, I made sure his medical bills were covered, and his family would be taken care of." The words hit me like physical blows, restructuring everything I thought I knew about my own life. My father worked for the Mafia? He did books for a restaurant that happened to be owned by people with complicated business interests. Lorenzo moved into the room with careful steps, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. He never knew the full extent of their operations, never participated in anything illegal. He was just an honest accountant who helped keep their legitimate businesses running smoothly. And when he died, my voice sounded hollow, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I took responsibility for honoring the agreements my organization had with him, including making sure his daughter could finish her education without drowning in medical debt. Lorenzo's gaze never left mine, unflinching in his honesty despite the pain it was causing both of us. "The scholarship that covered your remaining tuition after the insurance money ran out? That came from me. The job at the bookstore that paid exactly enough to cover your living expenses? I own that building." The revelation struck me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and leaving me gasping for understanding. My entire adult life had been orchestrated by a man I'd met less than 2 weeks ago. My independence nothing more than an elaborate illusion designed to keep me safe and unaware. "You've been controlling my life for years." The accusation came out as a whisper, but it carried the weight of fundamental betrayal. Everything I thought I'd accomplished on my own, every sacrifice I made to build something independent, it was all a lie. "No." Lorenzo's response was immediate and fierce. "Your intelligence, your determination, your compassion for people who are suffering, none of that came from me. I just made sure you had the opportunity to develop those qualities without being destroyed by circumstances beyond your control. Like my parents were?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. Lorenzo's expression darkened, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. "Your parents' accident was investigated thoroughly by both the police and my people," he said carefully. "There was no evidence of foul play, no connection to any criminal organization. Sometimes tragedy is just tragedy, Maya. Sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all." Relief flooded through me at his words. followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. My parents' death in a car accident had been traumatic enough without adding murder and conspiracy to the grief I'd carried for 4 years. But you still felt responsible for taking care of me. I felt responsible for honoring my predecessor's commitments. But somewhere along the way, it became personal. Lorenzo moved closer, his presence filling the space between us with the same magnetic intensity I'd felt in the restaurant. Watching you grow from a grieving teenager into a strong, independent woman, seeing how you refused to let tragedy define your future. You became someone I admired before I ever spoke to you. The admission sent warmth through my chest despite the anger and confusion swirling through my thoughts. Is that why you paid Derek's debts? To protect your investment in my well-being. I paid Derek's debts because the thought of someone using you as collateral made me want to commit violence that would have started a war. The honesty in his voice was brutal and somehow comforting. You weren't an investment, Maya. You were someone I'd grown to care about from a distance. And suddenly, you were in danger because of choices someone else had made. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only exhaustion and something that might have been hope. The night at Il Sogno, when you intervened with the waiter, you knew who I was before I ever showed you that text message. I knew exactly who you was. What I didn't know was whether you'd forgive me for keeping the truth from you for so long. Lorenzo reached out tentatively, his fingers barely brushing against my cheek, or whether you'd be able to accept that someone like me could offer protection without expecting something in return. And now you know everything. And you have a choice to make. His hand dropped away, restoring the physical distance between us even as the emotional connection deepened. You can walk away from all of this. The danger, the complications, the association with someone whose enemies see you as a weakness to exploit. I'll make sure you disappear so completely that neither Derek nor the Russos nor anyone else will ever find you. Or, Lorenzo's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his entire face in ways that made my heart race despite everything I'd learned. Or you stay and help me figure out what this is between us. Not obligation or protection or manipulation, but whatever's been building since that night in the restaurant when you refused to be intimidated by circumstances beyond your control. The choice he was offering felt monumental. The kind of decision that would reshape the entire trajectory of my life. I could return to the illusion of independence, start over somewhere far from New York and the complicated world of violence and loyalty that Lorenzo inhabited. Or I could acknowledge that independence had always been partly illusion, and choose to build something real with someone whose protection had evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. The Russos, I said, needing to understand the full scope of what I'd be choosing. Are they still a threat? Victor Russo is planning something significant. Derek's information gave them intelligence about my security procedures, my personal investments, even details about this safe house. Lorenzo's expression hardened with the cold calculation I'd seen glimpses of before. But they made a mistake when they involved you directly. That changed the rules of engagement. What does that mean? It means this stops being about territory or business or old grudges between families. Lorenzo's eyes held mine with unwavering intensity. It becomes personal. And when things are personal, I don't follow the same constraints I use for ordinary business disputes. The promise of violence in his voice should have terrified me, but instead, it sent a different kind of heat through my body. The recognition that someone was prepared to fight for my safety with everything he possessed. After years of taking care of myself, of making every decision alone and facing every challenge through determination and careful planning, the idea of someone willing to wage war for my protection was intoxicating in ways I'd never expected. If I stay, I said carefully, what happens to us? Lorenzo's smile deepened, and he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the cedar and leather scent that had become associated with safety and danger in equal measure. If you stay, we find out together. No more secrets, no more protection from a distance, no more pretending that what's between us is anything other than what it actually is. And what is it exactly? Something worth fighting for. His hand cupped my face with exquisite gentleness, thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. Something worth changing the rules for. Something worth risking everything to protect and explore, and build into whatever it's supposed to become. I leaned into his touch, decision crystallizing in my chest. like ice forming on winter glass. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to end this war before it destroys what we're trying to build. The Brooklyn Industrial District felt like the edge of the world at 3 a.m, abandoned warehouses looming against the October sky like monuments to economic decay. The air tasted of rust and old rain, carrying the scent of violence that hung over places where people went to disappear. I sat in the passenger seat of Lorenzo's armored SUV, my hands steady despite the automatic pistol Marco had insisted I carry, watching shadows move between buildings with predatory grace. "You don't have to do this," Lorenzo said for the third time, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Marco can take you back to the safe house, and this can be over in an hour, with me wondering for the rest of my life whether you survived." I checked the magazine of the gun again. Muscle memory from the crash course his men had given me over the past week. Besides, they have Derek. Whatever else he's done, he doesn't deserve to die because of my choices. Lorenzo's expression darkened at the mention of Derek, but he didn't argue. Victor Russo had made his position clear in the video he'd sent that morning. Derek bound and beaten, begging for his life while explaining that the Russos had been using him to gather intelligence on Lorenzo's operations for months. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had suspected, but seeing him terrified and bloodied had awakened protective instincts I hadn't known I possessed. "Remember," Marco said from the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the warehouse complex through night vision binoculars. "Your job is to stay alive and get out clean. We handle the violence. And if something goes wrong, then you use everything we taught you and find a way home." Lorenzo's hand covered mine, warm and steady despite the danger surrounding us. "Because I'm not losing you to Victor Russo's ego or Derek's stupidity." The warehouse Russo had chosen for the exchange sat at the center of the industrial complex, isolated enough to muffle gunfire but accessible enough for multiple escape routes. Intelligence suggested he'd brought 8 men, while Lorenzo's team consisted of 12 carefully selected operatives positioned throughout the surrounding buildings. Numbers favored us, but Russo had home field advantage and nothing left to lose. "Movement," Marco reported, watching figures emerge from the main warehouse. 4 visible, probably more inside. They're following the agreed protocol. Lorenzo slipped out of the SUV with fluid grace, his movements controlled despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. I followed, the weight of the pistol solid against my hip, my psychology training helping me catalog threat indicators and stress responses in everyone around me. Violence was coming. I could see it in the way both sides positioned themselves, the careful spacing that allowed for quick draws, the hypervigilance that preceded bloodshed. Victor Russo emerged from the warehouse flanked by 2 bodyguards, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial decay surrounding us. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of cold authority that spoke of decades spent making life-and-death decisions without hesitation. When his eyes found mine, I felt evaluated and dismissed in the space of a heartbeat. "Lorenzo Marcelli," he called across the empty space between us, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "You brought the girl. How sentimental." "I brought what you asked for," Lorenzo replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Now show me Derek." 2 more men emerged from the warehouse, dragging Derek between them like a broken doll. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the damage. Swollen face, torn clothing, the unsteady gait of someone who'd been systematically beaten. But he was alive, conscious, and when he saw me, his expression transformed into something that might have been relief or terror. "Maya," he called out, his voice cracked and raw. "I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry for all of this." "Touching," Victor said with casual cruelty. "The boy has been very talkative about your security procedures, your business operations, even your personal habits. Amazing what people will share when properly motivated." The implication sent ice through my veins, but Lorenzo's expression remained unchanged. The deal was simple. I come alone with the girl, you release Derek, and we settle this like civilized businessmen. Except you didn't come alone. Victor's smile was sharp as broken glass. My men counted at least 8 snipers in the surrounding buildings. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Did you really think I'd walk into an obvious trap without insurance? Lorenzo's response carried the same cold amusement. Your reputation for keeping agreements isn't exactly stellar. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, tension coiling between the two groups like a living thing. Around us, I could sense movement in the shadows. Lorenzo's men adjusting positions. Russo's people preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. My psychology training kicked in, analyzing body language and micro-expressions, looking for tells that might predict who would move first. "Here's what's going to happen," Victor said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "You're going to walk away from this warehouse. The girl stays with me as insurance against future interference in my business interests. The boy dies as an example of what happens to people who steal from my family. Counter-proposal," Lorenzo replied with deadly calm. "You release Derek, apologize for involving an innocent woman in your business, and find a new city to operate in. Everyone goes home breathing." Victor's laugh was genuinely amused. "You think you're in a position to make demands? I have the hostage. I have the advantage of position, and I have nothing left to lose. Your protection of the girl has cost me significant time and resources, and your kidnapping of her has made this personal." Lorenzo's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Which means the rules just changed." The first shot came from the warehouse roof, a sniper's bullet that shattered the industrial silence like breaking glass. Victor's men responded instantly, professional training overriding surprise as they sought cover and returned fire. Lorenzo tackled me to the ground behind our SUV, his body shielding mine from the chaos erupting around us. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his own weapon with practiced efficiency. "No matter what happens, stay behind cover until this is over." But chaos had its own logic, and Derek's panicked flight from his captors took him directly into the crossfire between the two sides. I watched in horror as he stumbled and fell, blood spreading across his chest from a wound I couldn't see clearly. Without thinking, I broke from cover, using skills Lorenzo's people had taught me to move from shadow to shadow, reaching Derek's position while gunfire erupted overhead. "Maya, get back." Lorenzo's voice carried over the sound of automatic weapons, but I was already kneeling beside Derek, assessing his injuries with the clinical detachment my psychology training had taught me to maintain under stress. "It's not that bad," I told him, though blood was soaking through his shirt at an alarming rate. "Just stay still and let me help." "You shouldn't have come," Derek gasped, his face pale with shock and blood loss. "This is my fault, all of it. You should have let them kill me. Nobody deserves to die for making stupid choices." I pressed my hands against his wound, trying to slow the bleeding while staying low enough to avoid the firefight raging around us. Just focus on breathing and staying conscious. Movement in my peripheral vision made me look up to see Victor Russo approaching with his remaining bodyguard, using Derek and me as human shields while his men provided covering fire. His expensive suit was torn and bloodied, his silver hair disheveled, but his eyes held the same cold calculation I'd seen in the initial standoff. "Predictable," he said, pressing the barrel of his pistol against my temple. Lorenzo Marcelli's weakness has always been his need to protect people who don't deserve protection. The metal was cold against my skin, but my psychology training helped me remain calm, analyzing options and potential outcomes while my conscious mind focused on keeping Derek alive. Around us, the gunfire was slowing as both sides recognized the changed dynamics of the situation. "Let her go, Victor." Lorenzo's voice came from somewhere behind overturned shipping containers, steady despite the circumstances. "This is between us. Now it's between all of us." Victor's grip on my shoulder was painful, but not desperate. He was still in control, still calculating advantages. "The girl dies unless you call off your men and surrender yourself for execution. And if I do that, you'll kill us all anyway." Lorenzo's assessment was matter of fact, professional evaluation, rather than emotional pleading. "So, what exactly are you offering? A quick death, instead of a slow one?" Victor's honesty was brutal and strangely refreshing. The girl has seen too much, knows too much about operations on both sides. She's a liability that can't be allowed to survive. The psychology textbooks I'd studied had covered hostage situations, but none of them had prepared me for the clarity that came with accepting potential death. Fear remained, but it was controlled now, channeled into focus that let me catalog every detail of our position, every potential advantage or escape route. "Maya," Derek whispered, his voice growing weaker as blood loss took its toll. My jacket pocket. There's something you need to know. I slipped my hand into his jacket, feeling a small recording device that was still warm from his body heat. Evidence, I realized. Proof of whatever deal he'd made with the Russos. Insurance he'd kept in case this moment ever came. What is it? I asked. But Derek's eyes were already losing focus, consciousness fading as his body fought to survive wounds that might be beyond my ability to treat. Victor noticed the exchange, his attention sharpening on the device I'd pulled from Derek's pocket. What did you find, girl? Nothing, I lied, palming the recorder while keeping pressure on Derek's wound. Just his phone. But Victor's suspicious expression suggested he didn't believe me, and his grip on my shoulder tightened in ways that promised more immediate violence. Around us, the silence stretched, as both sides waited for resolution that would determine who lived and who died in this abandoned corner of Brooklyn. The shot that ended the standoff came from an impossible angle, Victor Russo's bodyguard collapsing as Lorenzo appeared from cover I hadn't seen him reach. In the split second of confusion that followed, I rolled away from Victor's grasp, using momentum and Derek's weight to break free, while Lorenzo closed the distance with lethal efficiency. What followed was brutal and brief, hand-to-hand combat between two men who understood that only one would leave the warehouse alive. When it ended, Victor Russo lay motionless on the concrete, and Lorenzo stood over him with blood on his hands and victory written in every line of his body. Is it over? I asked, still kneeling beside Derek, who was breathing but unconscious. It's over, Lorenzo confirmed, his voice steady despite the violence we'd just survived. For all of us. 10 months later, I stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Manhattan penthouse, watching the city pulse with late afternoon energy 40 stories below. The view never stopped taking my breath away. Central Park spreading like an emerald carpet to the north, the Hudson River catching sunset light like scattered diamonds, the endless sprawl of humanity pursuing dreams and ambitions that seemed impossibly small from this height. My reflection in the glass showed a woman I barely recognized from the terrified college student who'd been stood up at Il Sogno less than a year ago. The expensive business suit I wore had been tailored to accommodate the subtle changes pregnancy had brought to my body, while my hair fell in waves that spoke of professional styling rather than drugstore shampoo and hope. But the biggest change was in my eyes. They held confidence now, the assurance of someone who'd survived violence and betrayal and emerged stronger rather than broken. Mrs. Marcelli, your 4 o'clock appointment is here. The voice belonged to James, Lorenzo's personal assistant, delivered through the intercom system that connected our home office to the rest of the penthouse. After Victor Russo's death, we'd consolidated operations, bringing legitimate business dealings into the same space where we planned the less legal aspects of Lorenzo's empire. Send him up, I replied, straightening papers on my desk that contained acquisition details for 3 more properties in Queens. On the surface, they were real estate investments. In reality, they were strategic positioning for the expansion of territory that had followed our victory over the Russo family. Business was good, and I'd discovered an unexpected talent for making violence profitable through careful legal maneuvering. The man who entered our office 5 minutes later was nervous in the way that suggested he understood exactly who he was dealing with, but hoped politeness might protect him from consequences. Martin Webb, owner of a construction company that had been skimming materials from city contracts for the better part of a decade. Lorenzo's people had identified the theft, and now Mr. Webb was here to discuss terms for making his problem disappear. Mr. Webb, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Thank you for coming. I understand you've been having some difficulties with your municipal contracts. Yes, there have been some accounting irregularities. His eyes darted around the office, taking in the expensive furniture, the art that probably cost more than his annual income, the subtle indicators of power that seemed to make him shrink into himself. Nothing that can't be resolved with proper oversight. Of course. I opened his file, reviewing details that Marco's investigation team had compiled over the past month. $2.3 million in materials diverted from public projects over 18 months. Impressive scope for what you're calling accounting irregularities. Mr. Webb's face went pale, confirming what we already knew. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything. The interruption was delivered with the same quiet authority I'd learned from watching Lorenzo handle difficult negotiations. I'm stating facts based on thorough investigation. The question is whether you'd prefer to resolve this privately or through more official channels. The psychology training that had once seemed purely academic now served as a weapon more effective than anything Marco carried in his shoulder holster. Understanding human behavior, recognizing pressure points, knowing exactly how much fear to apply to achieve desired outcomes, these skills had made me valuable to Lorenzo's organization in ways I'd never anticipated. "What do you want?" Mr. Webb asked, the question emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Partnership." I slid a contract across the desk, its terms already negotiated based on psychological profiles our people had developed. "Your company becomes a preferred contractor for Marcelli Development. In exchange, the accounting irregularities disappear, and you gain access to projects that will triple your annual revenue within 2 years." It wasn't really a choice, and we both knew it. Mr. Webb could sign the contract and prosper under Lorenzo's protection, or he could refuse and face criminal prosecution, followed by the kind of bankruptcy that ended careers permanently. His signature on the document 20 minutes later was shaky, but legally binding. "Welcome to the family," I said, as he prepared to leave. "James will provide you with contact information for your new project manager. I think you'll find this arrangement mutually beneficial." After Mr. Webb departed, I returned to the window, my hand resting on the subtle curve of my belly, where our child was growing with each passing day. 6 months along now, carrying the next generation of whatever Lorenzo and I were building together. The thought should have terrified me. Bringing a child into a world where violence was always one wrong decision away. Instead, I felt protective in ways that went beyond normal maternal instincts. "How did it go?" Lorenzo's voice came from behind me, warm with the affection that had replaced the careful authority he'd used during our early encounters. I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, still wearing the expensive suit he'd worn to his own meeting downtown, but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed in ways that made him look younger and more approachable. "Mr. Webb saw reason," I replied, moving into his arms with the natural ease that had developed over months of learning to trust completely. "His construction company will be very useful for the Brooklyn expansion." Lorenzo's hands settled on my waist, careful of the changes pregnancy had brought to my body. "And how are you feeling about the expansion?" It was a question with layers, not just about business strategy, but about my comfort level with the violence that expansion might require. My willingness to be complicit in decisions that could destroy lives as easily as they improved our position. 6 months ago, I would have recoiled from such considerations. Now they felt like necessary calculations in a complex equation that had to balance power, profit, and survival. "I think we're ready," I said, surprised by how natural the admission felt. The Russo territory has been without strong leadership long enough that smaller organizations are starting to move in. Better to consolidate control before someone else decides they're brave enough to challenge us. Someone else like Antonio Russo. Lorenzo's expression darkened at the mention of Victor's younger brother, who'd been making subtle inquiries about avenging his family's honor. Intelligence suggests he's building alliances with families in New Jersey and Philadelphia. Then we handle Antonio before he becomes a problem. The casual way I discussed potential violence would have horrified the psychology student I'd been a year ago. Now it felt like strategic planning for protecting what Lorenzo and I had built together. I've been thinking about approaches that might resolve the situation without open warfare. Lorenzo's smile held genuine admiration, and something that might have been pride. "What kind of approaches?" "The kind that use his psychology against him." I moved to my desk, pulling out files that contained detailed behavioral analysis of Antonio Russo and his known associates. He's motivated by family honor and personal vengeance, but he's also practical enough to recognize when a fight isn't worth the cost. We just need to make the cost clear before he commits to action. And if negotiation doesn't work, then we make sure he understands the consequences of underestimating what we're willing to do to protect our family. My hand moved instinctively to my belly, protective instincts sharpening at the thought of anyone threatening the life we were building. Some lessons can only be taught through demonstration. Lorenzo pulled me closer, his arms encircling both me and our unborn child, with the same protective intensity that had first drawn me to him, despite the danger he represented. "Have I mentioned recently that I love the woman you've become?" "The woman you helped me become," I corrected, remembering the terrified girl who'd sat alone in Il Sogno waiting for a date who would never arrive. though I'm still not entirely sure whether that was intentional or accidental. Both, he admitted with the honesty that had become characteristic of our relationship. I knew you were strong enough to survive in this world. I didn't know you'd become essential to running it. The intercom buzzed with another call from James, this one announcing the arrival of Marco and his team for our weekly security briefing. These meetings had become routine, a way of staying ahead of threats while planning for expansion that would cement our position as one of New York's most influential families. Ready to hear about this week's adventures in empire building? Lorenzo asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Ready, I confirmed, settling into my chair while he took his position at the head of the conference table. Around us, the penthouse continued its elegant function as both home and headquarters, personal sanctuary and command center for operations that touched every aspect of New York's complex underground economy. Marco entered with his usual professional efficiency, followed by 3 other men whose loyalty Lorenzo had earned through years of mutual respect and shared danger. They nodded respectfully in my direction, not because I was Lorenzo's woman, but because I'd proven myself valuable to the organization's success through intelligence and strategic thinking, rather than just association. The Antonio Russo situation is escalating faster than anticipated, Marco began without preamble. He's reached out to families in Boston and Chicago, looking for support in what he's calling a justified war against the people who murdered his brother. Any takers? I asked, already mentally cataloging psychological profiles and potential pressure points for the organizations he'd contacted. 2 maybes, 1 definite no. Marco consulted his notes. But he's also been recruiting independent operators, people desperate enough to work for promises rather than guaranteed payment. Lorenzo's expression hardened in ways I'd learned to recognize as preparation for necessary violence. How many people are we talking about? Potentially 15 to 20, plus whatever support he gets from established families. Marco's assessment was thorough and sobering. Not enough to win a direct confrontation, but enough to cause significant damage before we eliminate them. Then we don't let it become a direct confrontation, I said, an idea crystallizing as I spoke. We make Antonio an offer that's too attractive to refuse, and we make sure he understands the consequences of refusing. What kind of offer? Lorenzo asked, his attention focused on me with the intensity that meant he was genuinely curious about my strategic thinking. I smiled, feeling pieces click into place with the same satisfaction I'd once derived from solving complex psychology problems, the kind that gives him everything he says he wants while ensuring he can never use it against us. And if he's smart enough to recognize the trap, then we make sure he's not smart enough to survive refusing it. The admission should have felt wrong, discussing someone's potential death with the same casual planning we might use for a business acquisition. Instead, it felt like protecting family, ensuring that the world Lorenzo and I were building for our child would be stable enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring. I love you, Mrs. Martelli, Lorenzo said, as the meeting continued around us, his voice carrying the same mixture of admiration and protectiveness that had characterized our relationship from its violent beginning. I love you too, Mr. Martelli, I replied, watching Manhattan pulse with life beyond our windows, while our child grew safely within the empire we'd built through careful combination of violence and strategy. And I love the life we're building together. It wasn't the life I'd planned as a naive college student working in a bookstore and dreaming of graduate school, but it was ours, built through choices and consequences that had transformed 2 people damaged by violence into partners strong enough to impose their own version of order on a chaotic world. And as I felt our child move beneath my heart, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together as equals in power and partners in the beautiful, dangerous life we'd chosen to create.